Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Irving Stonebraker. I'm an Associate Professor of History, and I'd love it if you would join me as I talk to Stephen and David on this current episode of Dual Citizens, where we're going to talk about what history is and why it matters.
Hello and welcome to Dual Citizens. I'm David Ould.
And I'm Stephen McAlpine.
And we are joined today, this is going to be a good one, Steve. We're joined today by Dr. Sarah Irving Stonebraker, author of recently published book, Priests of History. Welcome, Sarah. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, very exciting. Now, Sarah, tell us a bit about yourself. What do you do for a job? Where do you do it? Why do you do it?
Yep. So I'm an academic historian. I'm an Associate Professor of History and Western Civilization at the Australian Catholic University. So that's what I do for a job. Yeah. So professional historian, something that I've wanted to do since I was a child.
Yeah, how did you end up in that job?
I've been an academic like my entire career, got there through, and maybe we could talk about this later, but got there through a very kind of secular, progressive, non-Christian upbringing, going to study for my PhD at Cambridge and then at Oxford, sort of heart of secular academia. But then I got married in America, and then through America came back to Australia and ended up here at ACU.
Fantastic. And now here in Sydney.
Yeah. So that's the professional part of it. I'm married to Jonathan and we have 3 children, and we're part of a church plant in northwestern Sydney.
Oh.
Exciting.
Yeah.
The book?
Yeah, we're going to talk about your book, latest book, great catchy title, Priests of History. Why the book and that title in particular? We kind of, that's catchy.
Yeah.
It's a great
I was triggered by it. Priests.
Yeah. Priests of History.
Yeah. This low church.
It's trigger.
Reform guy.
So give us a little bit of info about the book.
Yeah, sure. So basically, I was prompted to write this book, I think really by the combination of 2 things, a kind of professional reflection that I made as an academic historian about a kind of cultural moment that we're living in at the moment and just how ahistorical it is, and then a kind of personal reflection as well. The professional reflection is that this kind of observation of just how ahistoric our current culture in the kind of post-Christian, post-secular West actually is. And what I mean by that is that I think we've basically, as a secular culture, kind of lost the ability to engage meaningfully with the past. And so specifically, to sum it up, when I looked at our culture as a historian, I basically saw kind of 3 really kind of profoundly ahistoric tendencies. The first is that we tend to think of history as irrelevant. So in the sense that our current kind of understanding of what it means to live a really good life in the West is that we just kind of invent ourselves. We tell our own story. But if life is all about kind of like relentless self-invention, then anything historical, any kind of enduring historical narrative is just irrelevant to that project. So I'm just inventing myself. So that's the first thing, is kind of history is kind of irrelevant to our culture. The second is that we tend, I think, largely to be really ignorant of history. There's all kinds of empirical data about this, but it's generally the case that, we know less and less actually about our history, about where our institutions came from, about where our kind of moral commitments, particularly in the West, about things that we actually think are so central to how we live life, like commitments about the equality of all human beings, for example. Yet actually, when you ask people, they know very little about where those ideas actually came from. So that's the second thing, kind of ignorance, historical ignorance. And then the third is, and they all start with I, so this is fairly handy to remember, but the third is ideology, right? In the sense that when we do tend to have conversations about history in the public sphere, they tend to devolve into culture wars and into ideology. So it seems like we've lost the ability to have a kind of meaningful and sort of fruitful disagreement about the past, to kind of see it in terms other than just condemn or celebrate, to actually hold ethical complexities about the past. So those kind of 3 things, professional observations. And then the other thing that kind of prompted me to write the book actually is a really personal thing, which is so I didn't grow up in a Christian home or anything. I became a Christian in my sort of mid to late 20s, having gone through that sort of very secular academic pathway of Cambridge and Oxford, like I mentioned. But when I kind of reflected on the way that I came to faith, what I began to realize is that it was in no small part a large role that history played in kind of evangelizing to me, as it were. There's a lot I could say about this, but really just kind of illustration is that it was very clear to me that, first of all, the basic kind of moral intuitions I had about the equality and dignity of human life, which I kind of assumed would be sustained by atheism. I kind of identified myself as an atheist in my 20s. It was very clear to me when I was at Oxford and kind of engaging with the work of Peter Singer, well-known kind of atheist, ethicist and philosopher, that actually these ideas are not sustained by atheism at all. And actually they're a historical legacy of Christianity. And so actually in a broad sense, and combined with that, the fact that I was, for my doctoral thesis, working on the history of the origins of modern science and recognizing that these scientists held their faith very seriously. So in a broad sense, like history evangelized to me in the sense that it was actually history which compelled me to take Christianity seriously intellectually. So it's like, hold on, history played a really important role here in my own kind of journey to faith. And then the other part of that, of course, was that I was so aware that I had really kind of only my own story in life. I mean, there was this moment at Cambridge when I was reading the work of Robert Boyle, and this takes us to the white priest of history as well, which David's triggering point. So I'm reading Robert Boyle, 17th century chemist, one of the founders of modern science. And Boyle kind of talks about, in his scientific works, here he is quoting Psalm 8, and he's talking about the fact that he thinks of himself as a priest of nature and using all this kind of priestly language, which to me as a non-Christian at the time was really striking. But what I kind of realized thinking about that was, and realizing how much I kind of lived a life where I didn't think of myself as part of anything larger, any kind of larger enduring narrative, I kind of realized that atheism couldn't provide me with any larger story, and that whatever I was living, I had no larger story. And there was a kind of yearning there to be part of a story that gave life meaning. So reflecting on those things kind of led me to write a book, which is both scholarly and academic, but actually for a general audience that kind of is intending to say to our culture, and especially to Christians, hold on a minute, we live in a really ahistoric culture. So how can we actually engage well with history, and how can that help us?
Yeah. That's a question. So you mentioned Singer, and you opened up your book very early mentioning that encounter, and that's obviously that was one of the aha moments for you. As people are watching or listening to this, is there maybe something in our contemporary culture that you can point to, our sort of our common life together, where you can go, look, there's a great example of how we're utterly adrift from history, how we're telling our own story as opposed to seeing ourselves in a historical story? Are there any sort of current issues being debated or decisions sort of governments have made where you go, look at that, that's a great example, even without putting value on it, just going, there it is? Yeah, okay.
I think if you look at various very important issues that we're debating, and these are kind of political hot button issues too in our public discourse, debates about euthanasia, debates even globally about things like abortion, debates about what it is to be, really they come down to what it is to be human, debates about marriage and so forth. It's quite clear that all those kinds of debates are discussed in a very kind of very thin manner in terms of history. It's very rare that people make any kind of historical reference, other than there'll be a few Christians on the sidelines doing this, but we very rarely kind of appeal to history and say, oh, hold on, historically, the way that we have thought about what it is to be human, or what human life is, or even a sort of more political issue about the role of government and its role in human life. Here are the various ways and the conversations that we've had about this topic historically. Therefore, this is why that might actually matter today. Most of the discourse is just what McIntyre calls emotivism. We just kind of say, I feel this and you feel this, but we don't actually appeal to the past.
Yeah, and ironically, the term that comes up all the time, especially in emotivism, you've got to get on the right side of history.
Yes.
And I was reading something the other day that of all our presidents, Barack Obama mentioned back then.
Yeah.
But if you're in an ahistoric age, what does that even mean to be on the right side of history? It feels like it's just a cosh to bash you over the head if you aren't on some agenda somewhere.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it reduces history to ideology. It's either right or wrong. It's either condemn or celebrate. And that's all history is. So history is just a means to an end, which is our political or ideology. Yeah.
Oh, it's fascinating to see those things woven together, seeing how they make sense together. Let me just ask another question then about we want to talk some more about, well, what's the answer? How do we rediscover it? But let's talk a little more about how we ended up there in the first place. So a number of people have written narratives now of explanations of how we got there. I mean, Truman's Rise and Triumph is a classic example. But how would you describe how we've ended up in this place where all our stories are... Well, it's interesting because we so want story. We're in an age that so wants stories. And I've been told for the last 10 years or so that the best evangelism is now going to be storytelling, not the propositional stuff we sort of had the legacy from the 80s and 90s. Yeah. But how we ended up in a culture that loves story, and you do your reels on you tell your stories on Instagram and stuff, and we're so divorced from
the
story, like actual stories.
Okay,
how we ended up there?
Just an easy.
Yeah. Okay, without giving like a broad history lecture.
Yes.
Yeah. One of the distinctive characteristics of the modern West, and particularly like liberalism, is that it thinks about the individual divorced from any kind of larger context. And so we basically created societies in the West, regardless, that are kind of broadly speaking liberal in some way or another, in the sense that they basically kind of privatize any kind of understanding of what the good is. Whereas historically, like in the pre-modern world and in like the West, Christendom, there's basically like a shared or common understanding that society and political society, the family, any kind of element of society is oriented toward a shared understanding of the good. But in modernity, you kind of have this kind of understanding in the liberal West, and then that kind of gets globalized, that really our understanding of freedom and what it is to live in society is basically to like liberate the individual from any kind of larger or external source of authority. And because of that, this is why it's relevant to history, because of that, there is no longer any kind of sense that we share historical stories that are common to all of us that we can appeal to. This is partly why too we kind of tend to get into ideology and culture wars conversations, because we can't appeal to kind of common stories. Or even like the common principles that might emerge from those kind of stories. But B, that we kind of tend to think of ourselves so atomistically that we think about life on that very individualistic level in terms of, we still, like you mentioned before, David, like we still think in terms of stories, but now, to kind of paraphrase Stanley Hauerwas, the wonderful theologian, the only story I have is my own,
right,
like in liberal thought.
So I write my own story and I tell my own story, but I'm no longer part of another story that something external to me is telling, that by nature then actually controls the script. Is that right? I long to be free from that script.
Exactly. There's a yearning to kind of constantly liberate oneself from anything external.
And it's interesting too, you point out that people signing up to do history is plummeting.
It is plummeting. This is, dear to my heart.
Yeah, I was going to say that must hurt.
Yeah.
And that's because of that. It's history's, was it Henry Ford history's bunk? But now it's like it's not even considered at any level.
Well, yeah, and particularly in Australia, actually, for various interesting historical reasons, we tend to think of education purely in terms of getting a job, like utility. It's a means to an end. So what use is history?
Do you think part of it as well is, I'm sorry, this is my other dual citizenship coming through, is our history, as we understand it as Western civilization, is fairly limited in Australia. Is there a sense in which, because it's sort of slightly shorter here, we've got maybe 250 years of it, as opposed to, back home, that history had hardly begun 250 years ago. Is there a sense in which there's less of it as well, so that might be even more polarising here in Australia, crystallising?
It's probably partly that, but probably the particular history of that idea in Australia, which is that Australians have from the very beginning, and this you see this in the colonies coming together to ask this question about, like, what does it mean when we federate, we become a nation? We're part of Britain's story, and yet there are things that they do that try to think of themselves in the context of, but also separating themselves from Britain, like not having an established church, for example, the Constitution, Section 116. But so they try to separate themselves from Britain, but they're always in dialogue with that. But then if you look at the popular imagination in Australia in the last few generations, basically with the legacy of being British, and then the kind of ramifications of that with like the end of the White Australia policy, the advent of multiculturalism after World War II, we have, with this kind of rather short history in Australia, had this kind of very fraught dialogue with our own kind of British heritage and ancestry. So there's a particular question in Australia about what does it mean to be Australian?
I'm always intrigued by Australian history because I went back to Northern Ireland for a couple of years and we suddenly did the bigger picture UK history. I found that interesting.
Cool.
In a way that I found it, I'm not so sure I'm connecting with it. But it's not just about facts, is it? When you talk about history, it's causality, isn't it? What's going on here? That's what you're more interested in. Because people generally think, a bunch of facts.
Yeah, that's right.
But you're saying why. You want to mine into why we're doing things.
History, only on some kind of basic level is history kind of empirical collection of facts. It's about trying to understand how it is that these facts actually fit together, and the kind of stories that we can actually tell about them.
And how does it look? We'll get to the church issue, because I think this is interesting thinking about church, because as Dave's saying, Carl Trueman has written about how we've got to get back to the creeds and confessions. And so he's hitting it from one angle.
It's an appeal for history, right?
Yeah, it's an appeal to history. And then you've got Tom Holland, and then you've got Glenn Scrivener talking about the air we breathe, the historical air. Why is history, from your perspective as an historian, so critical for the church to hold on to? And it seems that there's signs that some people are coming back to it. Why do you think it's so critical?
A couple of reasons. I think it's critical in our worship. I think it's critical in our discipleship. I think it's critical for evangelism, actually. It's critical, take the evangelism thing first. As I mentioned before, it's actually realizing the kind of paucity of my own story and whatever lack of story was offered to me by my atheist commitments that made me kind of take Christianity intellectually seriously. The other thing about, I think, why history matters in terms of evangelism and how as dual citizens to engage with culture.
Thank you. Get your church.
I just read the mug, Dave. The other thing about this is that we're now living in this moment culturally where it's not so much the truth, persuading people of the truth of Christianity, that's one thing, but it's also that Christianity is good and it is beautiful. And actually, when I think about this, and in the kind of context I have where I'm sort of teaching and mentoring, like people who are exploring Christianity in a sort of my personal life, but also actually when I think about this in an academic context, in my own story, it's actually also history that persuaded me that Christianity was good and that it was beautiful. So, for example, it's actually realized, so one of the big kind of, I think, assumptions and kind of caricatures people have of Christianity is that it's purely like any kind of secular association where people are united purely by the fact that they agree on certain kind of abstract propositions. But actually, if you can show them that historically and biblically, Christianity, becoming a Christian is to be invited into and adopted into a long historical people with a rich, incredibly rich tradition of spiritual disciplines and practices and ways of living, they go, oh, hold on a minute. There is actually a historical story here, which is beautiful, which is appealing, which is good. And that can actually be that's actually a way of showing people, oh no, actually there's an invitation here to be part of historical people, not just like a tribe, a lifestyle group.
Yeah, and if you think back to how sermons have been crafted, even in sort of a more sort of popular way of thinking about church, they tap into that liberal idea, don't they? Of this is about you and a personal relationship, and working yourself out. It's 5 sermons on marriage or whatever, and you've got this little slice of we've just sort of baptized the culture with a bit of Christianity, rather than saying, And one of the lines you put in your book, it's just, we're in line with, all these, it's a Hebrews issue. We're in line with all these saints. We're joined together. And Christians don't even think like that often. We're sort of stuck in the culture.
Part of a much bigger thing.
Yeah, and we don't think like that.
That pre-existed me and will unless he comes back,
go past you.
Yeah.
Well, like here I think is a really good example of this. I think we tend to be, and this now takes us from evangelism to like why history can be helpful to us as dual citizens in terms of like how we disciple each other. I think we tend to be instinctively suspicious of, particularly in some parts of the evangelical church, a little bit suspicious of the idea that like our traditions and perhaps liturgy and creeds, even like how these things, spiritual practices historically, we tend to be suspicious that they might actually be able to help us today. But actually, one of the things that I found, I kind of wrote about this in the book, that has been incredibly kind of eye-opening is that back in the 17th century, for example, there were historically all kinds of like really rich spiritual disciplines and practices. So one of the illustrations I talk about in the book is the fact that in the 17th century in England, there's a community living together of Anglicans in a little village called Little Gidding. And they engage in certain disciplines, like spiritual disciplines and practices that we've basically kind of forgotten now. So, for example, they engage in something called a night watch, which has an incredibly long history, goes back to the rule of St. Benedict. But too often in the evangelical church today, we think, oh no, Benedict's before the Reformation. Yeah. We certainly can't talk about Benedict. And so, no, like the routine of actually practicing rhythms of prayer during the day and holding night watches during the night. It's also, of course, in the Bible. It's what Paul and Silas do, what Jesus does, like to watch and wait and pray through the night. This is actually a really old ancient spiritual practice that dates back to the early church, used in the 17th century, and yet we kind of tend to...
It's the idea of the daily office, right? Morning and evening prayer.
Yeah.
Well, that would be my job in the 17th century. Get up in the morning, hold morning prayer. Everyone's off to the fields. Yeah. They join you for morning prayer.
Yeah. And this is a way of
And then when they come back at night, they're joining me again.
Exactly. Giving a rhythm to your day.
There must be a way of writing that into modern life, right? Because it feels like if I look at the calendar of history, it's end of year financial sale, Black Friday. We've changed our lens through which we're reading how the world works feels very different.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I sort of talk about in the book. And I talk about the fact that, a few years ago, my family decided to kind of use the Book of Common Prayer and those rhythms of the daily office, but also the kind of weekly and yearly rhythms of structuring our time in order to kind of reorder the way that to tend and keep our time, in order to kind of restructure the way that we live our life. And then another example of a kind of spiritual discipline we don't even really think about now is the practice of when we gather together to have meals and have fellowship, of reading aloud, and not just reading aloud from the Bible, but actually reading aloud from other texts, and therefore having a conversation about this. And then another one, this is one of the ones that I find that a lot of people are most surprised by actually and interested in. There's this thing called Protestant meditation, which is talked about in the 17th century, but most people, like I had a conversation with a friend today who's like, I thought Protestant meditation was something that Eastern religions practiced, or maybe some monks in the ancient, no, Puritans in early America, 17th century, but we don't even know this stuff. And so there's an incredible richness here of spiritual practices historically that we're ignorant of largely. And then if we can actually draw upon them today, I think they can hold such riches for us.
I think it seems like there's a movement among some younger people. So you're seeing a return to Gen Z, men are coming to church, and then you find people moving to the crunchy Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism.
Yeah.
For the historical things. Now, that's not necessarily theologically going to align with me, but I understand why people take that on.
Yeah.
Because it feels like it's rooted into something rather than this aimless sort of atomized thing that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And actually one of the kind of background questions that was in my mind when I wrote the book was I was aware of this kind of tendency of people, this searching for rootedness and this attraction that some new Christians are having to run off to the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Roman Catholic Church. I've actually seen it happen. And so part of me wanted to write this book specifically for evangelicals to say, hold on a minute, this is happening. We need to engage with history and show that, no, there's a richness to Protestant history and spiritual practices and disciplines. I have a whole chapter where I talk about sacredness and beauty and art. And Protestants need to do this.
Yeah, look, that was critical to me. The word that you used early in the book, and it keeps coming up, and it's a word I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, is the transcendence word. Right?
Yeah, cool.
We're thinking history this way, horizontally, but there's a vertical transcendent issue going on as well, isn't it? So when you're talking about history, you're not just talking about that. You're talking, or story, you're talking, It's got to be linked into something that's not just historical, and certainly not ahistorical, but transcendent as well.
So is it a fair critique then of some of our sort of very low church Protestant cultures? And Sydney would be a great example. We've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, there are things we've been responding to. So again, the word priest is triggering is the right word, right? But there's a whole thing that comes with that might come with that we've thrown away quite rightly, but at the same time we've ditched that historicity. And we've we've shot ourselves in the foot.
Well, I agree. I mean, I agree. So how controversial can I get here?
Yeah, how controversial do you want to be?
So
dueling.
Look, I agree.
That's right.
I love it.
That's right.
Just look, I agree. And I think, let me give a kind of practical sort of illustration of this. Historically, the Lord's Supper, even like after the Reformation, was still, despite, of course, rejection of transubstantiation and that theology and the kind of course, the theological battles over various editions of the Book of Common Prayer, regardless, there was a reverence, and still in the 39 Articles, which everyone will sign when they graduate from Moore College, which actually define, like, as you guys know, the doctrinal standard of Anglicanism. What happens in the Lord's Supper is this gets back to Steve's love of this word transcendent. It's very important, like something transcendent is happening. It's not transubstantiation, but something transcendent is happening. And actually, this is why history matters too. Historically, Anglicans, Protestants, even Puritans too, regardless of whether or not they're Anglican, have treated the Lord's Supper and what we do when we celebrate the Lord's Supper with a great deal of sincerity and reverence. They may not be on their knees, they may not but there's reverence there because there is a God, believe it or not, who is transcendent, and there is something transcendent happening. It's a sacrament. And yet, in the contemporary church, I think one of the best illustrations of the degree of ahistoricism, and illustrating what you guys were just talking about, is that sometimes there's a kind of irreverence, right? Like in the Lord's Supper, there's a kind of not taking it seriously, a kind of joking around. Maybe there's a bit of pop music in the background. It's like, hold on a minute.
Don't want that.
That's never how it's been
and
historically.
increasingly I'm noticing it. So I'm not an Anglican, so for my sins. But when we planted a church, there's an ahistoricity to church planting networks if you're not careful, right? But the first thing we did when we planted it, we said we're going to have communion every week. And there was a bit of pushback against that.
Okay, interesting.
And but we did every week. And it got to the stage where people felt odd if we didn't, because I wanted us to respond to the gospel with the Lord's Supper, because I felt that we're dealing with God at that point. Yeah. Because nothing else in our cultural frame would say that.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think it's really interesting. Because, and the flip side of that coin is, how far from transcendence can you get if you're just irreverent? Like, that's actually an embrace of postmodernism.
Irony.
Which, it's all about irony and playfulness. So let's all be ironic and playful when we joke around about the body and blood in the...
That's right. But we hunger and thirst for far more than that, don't we? Yeah. And so actually...
Yeah. That's why I like your book, because Justin Brearley, in his book, The Surprising Rebirth of the Belief in God, which you've probably read, he starts off as telling the narrative, but it becomes very apologetic and evangelistic. And I found you did that well. That Robert Barron, talked about the need for beauty in our presentation. It felt like, and the Tim Keller line, you'd want it to be true even if you didn't believe it. Yeah, and I felt when you...
See, I wanted to ask about that, because I love the way that your story is woven through it, which fantastic. Is necessarily because what you're saying is this is the engagement that you've had that you want other people to have.
And that was so warming, wasn't it? It was very warming.
So to what extent is that possible for us to do, I think, in our evangelism, either individually or corporately, to sort of tell the story of our engagement with history, to get other people to engage with it? Is that like, how overt are you trying to be in the book about the whole thing?
Yeah, well, I think depending on your context, you're going to be, sometimes you're in the workplace, sometimes you're in family, sometimes you're in church. There's, different contexts require different things. But no, I'm being pretty overt about the need to kind of talk about history. We need to, I'll give an example. Like in my workplace, one of the things that I teach about is the history of the West, and the history of political thought. And so yesterday we're doing the history of the labour movement, in the history of political thought, and where I sort of questioned my students about this idea about where is it that this idea that we have to protect the vulnerable comes from? Obviously, it's secularized by the time you have people like Chifley, like in Australia, the Prime Minister in the late 1940s, talking about the importance of the state caring for the vulnerable. But I was trying to get them to ask where does this come from? So I think you have to be. I ask pointed questions, and they know that that is just, you don't have to be a Christian to answer that question. Like Tom Holland's not a Christian, he can answer that question. You read history and you actually understand the deep moral inheritance of the West from Christianity.
It's interesting. My daughter doing literature and history at university, and she did she's a Christian. You did a diploma of theology first before she went in. And I said to her, you will find that having a view of God brings, you're a believer, you're not going to understand your peers who are secular are not going to understand this the same way you are, because you've got a lens to look at it that's very different. And she said they were very ahistorical in all of her classes. They just had no anchor points in the past to link anything they were learning in the classroom.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes it's also the case that even the references to history that we do have in our culture deliberately kind of write out the Christian element to it. So here's an example. In the history of Indigenous Australians, the earliest Indigenous activists, people like William Cooper, who we talk about in the book, the origins of, so that there's a day of mourning in 1938 about the mistreatment of Indigenous people, but the call is, and William Cooper and then Doug Nichols, his nephew, who is a church planter, they're both evangelical Christians, and the call is for the gospel to go out to Indigenous peoples as part of anyway, historically, that's like the origins of NAIDOC Week. But when you read about William Cooper's story at the National Museum of Australia, or you read about Doug Nichols...
It's expurgated. Just take it out.
Yeah, a huge number of the pioneers of Australia came here because of the gospel.
But they take that
I can think of,
there's a lot of writing out of it. Yeah.
And you see that too in Europe, where they did the European Union did the history of Europe without mentioning the church. It's like, there's document, it's like the Polish push back on that a little bit, and that's just that writing out.
So let me ask, off script, we got to help our people to see this stuff. So apart from your book, which now is number one on the list, what book would you say? Here's a helpful book to give to people to begin to get them into this stuff. If I've just got one of my people has watched my podcast and says to me, "Hey, on Sunday, David, what can I read now?"
Yeah.
Where would you send them? Even if it's not a book, if it's like a video series or.
I think
your book clearly,
yeah, clearly. I think Glenn Scrivener's The Air We Breathe. Yeah, it's really good.
It's a good starting point.
Yeah.
And with I think about the Tom Holland thing's interesting to me because he's not a believer. As he's not quite there yet, right?
No, clearly not.
But he's almost that slightly dispassionate about Christianity, but he's very much saying, I may not believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but the early Christians did, and
I can see
everything.
Yes, and it changed everything. There's a history. There's a history.
So how do you engage with are you finding as you engage with secular historians that there's pushback, or there's I hadn't thought about it that way? What's the academic field like for you in that sense?
This book is really the first time that I have kind of brought faith in a pretty big way, like into a general audience, my faith and intellectual work together. So we'll see.
Well, I think the book itself just feels like a zeitgeist book to me. Like this is the kind of book that I know a lot of people are talking about, this historical stuff.
So this was my other thing. So I asked before how we ended up with a culture that loves story, just doesn't want the story. My next question for you is, how have we ended up within academia with this almost rediscovery of story? So we've mentioned so far Truman, who's done it. We've mentioned Scrivener's book. We've mentioned Holland's book. There are others as well. And now you've come along, and it's like there's this beautiful diamond that we can now see as people are rediscovering and re-talking about why. It's almost like the Ad Fontes moment at the start of the 16th century, sort of the rediscovery of stuff. What's prompted that, do you think, amongst in the academics that are now writing?
Because you didn't all get on the phone.
No. Or is there a secret club of people writing about it? I don't think so. So what's prompted this?
Yeah, I think, probably a couple of important things to say. The first is that like this is a kind of small group, like the people you're talking to, a very small group of people, tiny group of people compared with the majority of like secular academia. Which is still very much in a kind of like liberal, I think, we should also add Louise Perry to that as well, because her various critiques of the sexual revolution have taken her to making these kind of arguments too, actually, about the historical inheritance that we have in the West from Christianity. But like it's a fairly small group of like critics on the outside, and so we should probably recognise that the rest of academia I don't think is really there. And so then it becomes a question of, okay, so what's motivating this kind of like critical little voice on the outside? And I think that we have kind of reached a moment, I think, particularly in the last decade or so, which is where I really think the ahistoric age can be kind of dated to in the West, where it's a kind of like existential crisis, I think, for Western scholarship and Western liberal, in liberal societies.
History of Francis Fukuyama,
I think he admits he made a big mistake when he wrote that book, and then has written like another one since then about liberalism. But there's a kind of sense in which we're asking questions about, well, now that we're kind of in this age in which we are so completely individualistic and living in a culture in which there is no longer any kind of shared set of stories that we ascribe to, then this is a kind of crisis moment. And particularly too, I think, as we see even on a geopolitical level internationally, we see the rise of we see the rise of China, we see the rise of Russia, and there's this kind of question about like, well, okay, so where have we come from, and does that actually matter?
Oh yeah, and so the guys were going, we've seen this before.
Yeah.
Or even as you look at the recurrent stuff raging with Israel, it's none of the solutions that a lot of people are pushing for seem to be rooted in historical reality. They're just like, they're conceptual. We just have a ceasefire, and you go,
how does that look?
Have we not learned the history of right or wrong aside? Have we not learned the history of that culture and how things work? Yeah.
And look, when you mention Russia and China, you think their narrative is not insecure in of itself.
Yeah.
Like ours feels insecure. So they're not insecure about that.
Very confident who they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what their place is.
Yeah.
So it's probably, but Tom Holland's interesting, isn't he? Because he second best podcast out there.
So it's a tiny group. That says it's a tiny group of people, but the influence of a Tom Holland at a popular level
is huge. It's enormous.
Like the amount of people that download that podcast.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that reveals that there is a kind of yearning for a story that is larger than our own story.
Yeah. Because what we've got just isn't working. That's maybe it. So what do we say to Christians then as they read your book? Maybe Glenn's, maybe Tom's, yours, of course.
No.
Because Sarah read your book, she quoted it.
Well, I did actually write to you and say, this is a great book. And 2 pages later, I read a reference to me, and I went, I hope Sarah doesn't think I wrote her after I saw the reference.
Oh.
It was after, was it?
Yeah. But so... what do we say to our people now? So I've got to pass them. You're doing some slightly stuff that's like that as well. But I'm preaching on Sundays. I'm pastoring my people. They're going out every day into their workplaces and meeting with their friends and whatever. What's the thing?
What's the takeaway?
Yeah, what's the takeaway from this? What do I say to them?
Yeah. So basically, there's an incredible richness to the past if we learn how to actually steward it well, and that can involve, I think, not only kind of knowing intellectually how rich and how influential Christian thought has been in shaping our kind of moral intuitions in the West, and shaping like the history of our institutions and all this kind of stuff matters. But also for the pastor, it's important to know, I think, too, that in terms of worship and discipleship and evangelism, there's an enormous richness to history. Like there's an enormous richness to thinking about how historically people engaged in spiritual disciplines and practices, how they thought of themselves as the church, like adopted into a historical people, engaging in these things which meant that they actually lived into this truth that they were like a vertical community saved in time. And there's a richness there. And I think it's not even just about sort of educating. We tend to do this a lot, and it's important, like education, educating our flock, but it's also about, I think, showing them the kind of richness of history. So like one of the things that I talk about in the book is, like I mentioned, like art and beauty and sacredness. And so the fact that like historically, I look at the music of J.S. Bach, for example, the amazing composer, or the poetry of George Herbert, even the like poetry and music. When you read, I remember even as a non-Christian, I would read like T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets and like be moved to tears. Like there's something about our yearning for transcendence that Christians and non-Christians have, that if they actually engage with the richness of art and music and literature throughout the centuries, this actually gives them a way of praising God's transcendence.
We're binging the wrong things.
Yeah.
And just as you're saying that, I'm just going, one of the things I looked for to move me to tears these days, instinctively, I like we were chatting about a great show on Netflix recently and just going, but why did it stand out? Because actually it was rooted in something very historical.
And look, that's right. Look, I went to the Australian Chamber Orchestra. That shows my highbrow side. I took my son. Right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, and he was astonished by it.
Yeah.
It was very moving.
Yeah.
And then you got the provenance of the fact that the cellist was playing a cello that was built in 1616.
Oh, yeah, it's awesome. Yeah.
And suddenly those things come together. Yeah. And the audience was very religious. It was Bach, and they wanted something transcendent, but as Christians we had something to attach it to.
Yeah, yeah.
And they just felt the moment but couldn't quite land it. And then you open the doors of the opera house and you flood back out and
into reality.
There's ice creams and there's boats and there's
So is there a sense in which we're going, here's another altar to an unknown God. Let me introduce you.
Yeah, to the God of history.
Because you instinctively want to bow to it. You instinctively want to bow to it. Let me, the God of history, let me introduce you to.
Yeah, I actually said, I mentioned this in the book, but I also said it in an actual context the other day to people. So Thomas Tallis, the composer, listen to If You Love Me, which is, a quote from John's Gospel. And oh my goodness, you will be moved to tears. It actually does point you, poetry, music, the arts, because there is something ineffable about the human experience, the human condition, and we yearn for God. There is something about great poetry and music and art which is going to point us to that. So what better, talk about, we've got all kinds of examples in the book, but the other thing I guess I would say is perhaps encourage people to, listen to, and it's as easy these days, gosh, as, getting it on your, but listen to Tallis, listen to Bach.
Great way
and try not to be moved.
Yeah, I know. Great way to finish it. We start with history and then we talk about that moving aspect of it. We love the book. I think it's going to, it's hit a moment, I think, in where people are at. And looking forward to seeing people discussing it too. I don't know, book club somewhere.
Absolutely. And can I say, I appreciate the fresh way of looking at this topic that we've seen other people have been looking at, but just the weaving of the story, I loved so much. And I walked away from it, put it down, just going, I'm yearning to tell stories more, proper stories, and the story, and show how the great story that has captured each one of us actually then has almost like the ink from that has spilled its way through. I'm a preacher. Look at that. Yeah. All the different colours have just spilled their way through this great story, and to sit here at the end, as it were, of history as we know it, and to have no regard to that, is just to miss out, isn't it?
It was joyless.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Good.
Thanks, Sarah. Great to have you with us.
Thanks.